Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Today we welcome back one of our favorite guests, Tom Netting, who's here to give us an update about what's going on in Washington and at the Department of Education. Tom has worked in the public policy arena for over 28 years, advocating before Congress, federal agencies, and state governments on behalf of private institutions of higher education and post-secondary education companies. Tom is a leader in strategic policy development and advocacy for higher ed and workforce development, healthcare, veterans affairs, policies, and the procurement of federal appropriations. He also has got his finger on the pulse in Washington, and he's here today to talk about that. Tom, welcome back to the show.
Drumm, it's a pleasure to be back with you again.
It is, and it's been too darn long. There's been so many things going on in Washington. Let's just jump right into it. Neg Reg, negotiated rulemaking. Successful or a mess or both?
I think a combination of both, and I think rightfully so. Anytime you've got so many issues, keep in mind, Drumm, that between Committee 1 on affordability and student loans and Committee 2 on institutional and programmatic eligibility, and a sum total of 16 issue papers to be discussed, there's a lot of information, a lot of very detailed information that comes along with all of those proposals. I think that it is noteworthy that in Committee 1, they were able to get 4 areas of consensus, and that in Committee 2, they were able to get another 2, candidly, 1 more than I think all the handicappers thought that they would get, making that and breaking that down a little bit more relevantly. In Committee 1, the issues where consensus was reached included a number of beneficial changes in the area of total and permanent disability for students, elimination of interest rate capitalization, false certification discharges, and the new regulatory language around helping individuals that are incarcerated have second chance Pell. The key areas in Committee 1 where consensus wasn't reached and a heavy dose of issues included closed school discharges, additional support for public service loan forgiveness, a huge amount of focus on borrower defense to repayment issues, including binding arbitration as one of those, and the area of income-driven repayment.
Yeah. So the handicappers said they had, how many they thought they would get? I mean, I'm trying to make a joke here that's going off really badly.
Well, again, kind of like with your brackets, I think a lot of the brackets got busted early and then again busted late. We thought that a lot of the issues in Committee 1 would be taken care of. Moving on to Committee 2, there were 7 issues: ability to benefit, gainful employment, as well as administrative capability, financial responsibility, changes of ownership and control, certification procedures, and 90-10. The 2 areas that achieved consensus there, the one that was, I think all the handicappers thought would be consensus achieved, was ability to benefit. And in fact, on day 1 of the final session where they were going over that, the consensus wasn't achieved. It literally was the last 30 minutes of the last Friday of the discussions where one minor tweak from the department achieved consensus on that particular provision. The provision that I have to tell you I would have bet every bit of money I had would not achieve consensus, but did, was on the 90-10 rule and the changes that came about as a result of the American Rescue Plan and changes to the definition of 90-10 that through Congress, the department, all of the federal negotiators, and a lot of negotiating behind the scenes, a final draft and consensus on changes to that definition were in fact achieved.
Well, at least we got there with some of them. What do you think are the most impactful decisions that were reached with respect to those that came to consensus?
Again, I think that I'll kind of go through them very quickly. For incarcerated students, the fact that we have the statute now emulated with eligibility for Pell is important, and I think that is going to be very beneficial. The significant changes that build upon what the Biden administration has done in total and permanent disabilities, again, are impactful and I think that are very important. The ATB issue and providing the opportunity for states to develop processes for individuals without a high school diploma or GED to matriculate.
ATB means?
Ability to benefit.
Okay, got it.
Individuals without a high school diploma or GED to have access and entree into post-secondary education. And what has been done is through eligible career pathways, there is now a newly established way working through the states and the institutions for those individuals to see their way, as, pardon the pun, a pathway into post-secondary education.
Okay.
As I alluded to, under the 90-10 rule, which deals specifically with for-profit institutions, the ultimate changes that were made define and include all of federal assistance as part of the 90, but also discuss what can be included in the 10%, the offset in this equation that have to be done. The original legislation didn't include monitoring or tampering with the definition of the 10% side, but in looking at what was being done with the 90, it actually worked better for Congress to work with the department and work with the affected community, the proprietary schools, but also with those individuals that have concerns about the proprietary sector on a final composition of a regulation that included a nice balance. And candidly, I think that balance was achieved. So one of the major contentious issues, when you look at concerns that many of the state's attorneys general, legal aid society, and other groups have with proprietary education, for them to come to consensus around this definition, solely assessing the quality and eligibility of proprietary institutions, was a big deal.
Yeah, it really is. And to be able to get consensus on something like that from everybody is really important, especially for proprietary, because that's the area sector that you work in a lot.
Correct.
Yeah. So what are the biggest impact of the things that you thought were voted down, and what are the consequences of those?
Going again back to Committee 1, and then I'll follow through to Committee 2. The fact that borrower defense to repayment was not completed and brought to consensus was not a surprise, I don't think, once again, to anybody. There were 4 issue papers around revisions to borrower defense to repayment, in many instances looking to revert back to the Obama administration regulations, class action lawsuits as opposed to assessment on solely an individual claimant by claimant basis, the opportunity for the department itself, as well as now states attorneys general and other entities, to bring forward complainants that will start to develop a class, the ability for the secretary now, based on prior knowledge of the institution, to develop a class potentially itself, all leading to the potential for borrower relief, are major changes that were the reasons that the proprietary community in particular had concerns around borrower defense to repayment. The back and forth on pre-dispute arbitration agreements that were out under the Obama administration, allowed to come back in under the Trump administration, and now look like are once again going to be pulled under the proposed regulations if they go into final effect. Certainly public service loan forgiveness, you've seen a lot out of the Biden administration trying to help and give the 1-year period of eligibility for individuals that have FFELP loans to have those counted towards their public service loan forgiveness clock. I think that that'll probably even be extended. Income-driven repayment, so many different repayment options. They have basically, and the department truly did do a really good job and a yeoman's job of trying to clear away some of the minor nuanced differences in a number of those to give individuals a better understanding and a better capability to use those various repayment options to really look at those in need of support as they're looking to repay their loans. Moving over into Committee 2, candidly, Drumm, there was a lot of areas where other sectors of the higher education community had significant problems. The gainful employment regulations, which heretofore have predominantly been considered to be an area where proprietary schools would be the only detractor. That was not the case in these negotiations. For private nonprofits and other sectors of the community were concerned about the publication of small program and small program rates. that while they're protected from loss of eligibility, the putting forth of the information would potentially, without a great deal of additional definition and description, would potentially lead the consumer to have concerns about those programs. With regards to the areas around change of ownership and change of control, one of the areas that the department has been very sensitive to is the conversion of for-profit institutions to a nonprofit status in an attempt to try and put guardrails and significantly limit, or better put, to have a significant assessment of an institution seeking to go from for-profit to nonprofit status. They attempted to change the definition of a nonprofit institution. In doing so, between the second session and the third session, it was brought up by many of the nonprofit community that the changes would be highly problematic, and so much so that it might even undermine the established community that is private nonprofit. So there's a lot of work yet to be done there. Potentially, either the department needs to go back and revert back to the session 2 proposal, the red line proposal that many of the private nonprofits requested that they do, or find some other way to achieve a balance between the loophole that they believe they're hoping to close, or certainly limit and harm to the general definition and general focus of nonprofit education. One other issue that yet again came to light very significantly is around distance education. The department sought to make 2 changes to online education. The first was the desire to make it so that all online education programs are housed and emanate from the main campus. The department really didn't give a strong rationale as to why, but nevertheless, we're requesting that online education emanating from a branch campus or additional location needed to be moved, and that structure needed to be in the main campus. Well, you can imagine that institutions that have large setups and systems in one of those additional locations or branch campuses wanted a really strong justification of why they'd have to move all of that.
Yeah, for sure.
You compound that with a change that in the certification procedures that really would undermine a great deal of work at the state level with governors, as well as multiple different organizations. And what I'm talking about here is the state authorization requirements for online education. When last these were discussed, it was agreed upon that instead of having to have an institution meet the requirements for each individual state where they recruited a student for online education, that if they met the overarching standards of NC-SARA and the reciprocity that has been developed by all of those states, with the exception of California, around those state regulations, that would suffice, that meeting those comprehensive set of standards would be okay. Well, now the department is reverting back to stating that you have to meet each of the individual state requirements, as opposed to the NC-SARA homogenized, my word, not theirs, but the standardized, probably a more appropriate word, set of standards. And what this does is it takes us away from, NC-SARA really lifted the bar because there were a number of states where there really weren't a lot of standards. So they worked very diligently with the community, meaning the online community, and the states themselves, and the authorizing and policing authorities to come up with this strong set of standardized criteria. And now the department seems to want to go the other direction. The irony is the only outlier is California, and California has suggested that they don't believe that the standards are as rigid as California, but you hear from the other side that in fact, in many instances, they're more rigid than California.
Well, they are. It's crazy.
Well, again, I don't want to get into the push and pull of that particular political dynamic, but as you can tell, that makes this a very poignant hot button issue.
Well, it is in many ways, it's dismantling all the good that NC-SARA has done, and it's going to put an incredible compliance burden on any institution who has distance education, online education, and students that come from a different state than where the university is housed. Am I right?
Absolutely. And what it also does is it puts us back in a set of circumstances where, you think about how online education has grown. And we've shown, especially one of the things that I think that, yet again, one of the good things to come out of the pandemic, if we can, say anything good has come out of the pandemic, is that a lot of institutions were forced to go to hybrid models. Now, that's not to say that it's going to work for everybody, but it gave everybody to dip more than their toe into the ability to either do hybrid or fully online education. And I think a lot was learned from that process. And the ability to continue that going forward with the set of standards that are there and are functional and working seems to be a better course than trying to start over again.
Well, it is a much better course, and especially when you talk about those states who had lower standards, then this could essentially be a race to the bottom.
That was terminology that was used on more than one occasion in the negotiated rulemaking.
Oh, how prescient on my part.
There you go.
So, well, there's good that came out of it. There is some things that still need to be continued to work on. For those items that went to consensus, they go out as drafted, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And when I say go out as drafted, they get published in the register.
Right. The notice of proposed rulemaking is the next phase in the process for all of these regulations. In the areas where consensus was reached, the department is duty bound by the process to publish those as consensus was achieved. For those where consensus was not achieved, the department has the authority and the capability to propose the regulations as they see fit. More often than not, Drumm, they try to lean towards their final kind of best and final offer, which in each case was leading into the third session meeting, maybe with some changes based on what they heard in the final process, even in areas where consensus was not achieved. Where this all goes is, regardless of consensus or not, the public still has the opportunity to provide feedback and commentary. The negotiators that achieve consensus do not. That is one of the things about consensus that are written into the protocols. If consensus is achieved, you cannot speak ill of the very regulations that you helped to develop and gave consensus to.
Wait a minute. Now, you cannot or you should not?
Well, cannot is pretty forceful, and again, I don't see a lot of that. Doesn't mean the community can't try and, again, make favorable, friendly amendments or the like to try and clean it up. And sometimes those are very well met. In the areas where no consensus is achieved, it's an open forum. And again, when you look at these 17 issues and you look at both where consensus was achieved and those where consensus was not achieved, you're talking about a lot of commentary that I think the department will be duty bound to review coming up over the course of the spring and into the summer and into the early fall months, keeping in mind that if these regulations, if they want to achieve their implementation July 1 of next year, under the master calendar requirements written in law under the HEA, the regulations must be published in final form on or before November 1st of this year.
Yeah, and given all the cutbacks of staffing at the department and retirements, et cetera, I would be willing to bet that the staffing is probably not there to get all these things done. Just a guess on my part.
You're a good handicapper, and again, in a meeting that I was just a part of over the last 3 days, there's also other phases of the process. All of these have to go through Office of Management and Budget Review, OMB, and other internal review processes to make sure that they are capable of being, crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, as so it were. To do that for all of these, it is going to be Herculean, would probably be an understatement. But, you also have a department that is really, they wouldn't have put forth all of these issues if they weren't all significant and important enough for them to want to achieve change to. how they go about that and which ones are going to be elevated higher on that priority list, or which ones might be, okay, we can wait another year, are things that I could speculate and probably do well on some of them, but what's the point? What we all need to do is, as these regulations continue to move forward, be mindful of the publications in the Federal Register and of the NPRMs, the 30 probably day window for response, so limited time for response, make our positions known. In some instances, thumbs up, utilized basically by the negotiators of, hey, you guys have done this well. Hey, here's maybe a friendly tweak that you might want to consider. For those where there was opposition from a multiple array of different entities, still put your best recommendations forward in the hope that the department will look at those heading into the establishment of the final regs.
Yeah. So if it doesn't make it into the Federal Register by November 1st, the implementation would get delayed until July 1st of 2024.
That is correct.
Yeah. So for presidents who are listening, if you've got issues with some of these things, be sure you're watching the Federal Register to find out when, and the department's website to find out when you can start leaving comments.
And certainly NASFA and other organizations will share, National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators and others will provide those deadlines as they come forward, because we also anticipate that they won't do all of these at one time, that some of them will come out in chunks or packages, as we're starting to call them.
Exactly. So next topic, real quick, Title IX. We're hearing things coming out of the department. What's going on with that?
For quite some time, it has been quiet, but now you are absolutely right. There are a great deal of signals that comprehensive revisions to Title IX are pending and should be out within the next week or two. What I had heard was the second week in April. We'll all have to see what the devil of those details are. You'll recall that Title IX has literally been the area where the most public comment was ever received, over 110,000 and counting recommendations to the Trump administration's proposed revisions to the prior Title IX regulations. We'll have to see what, now that the Biden administration is in power, the modifications and changes are. But again, this is a very comprehensive, very important set of regulations, given all of what is included, not only issues with regard to female athletics, but all of the protections of all of the forms of different concerns of VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act, as well as all of the Clery Act provisions that deal with everything from fire and campus security and those rights to protections for the LGBT community and other things that are vitally important to all students. So this is going to be a big one once it comes out. Again, you're likely, probably with other individuals that you reach out to, going to want to have discussions around the devil of those details once we all start to see them. It will be vitally important to do so, but I don't have any advanced indication of what direction that comprehensive package is heading yet. So we're all kind of waiting, but I think much will be made more clear in the next week or so.
I certainly hope so. And if I was a betting man, which I'm not, but I'll say it anyway, I would be willing to bet that you're going to have a number of states sue the department with respect to the regulations that get published.
I think you're right. Again, even though a lot of this is protections, again, the Clery Act itself is named after Eugene Clery and the unfortunate circumstances that happened to her, and a lot of protections for women's safety and again, rights of so many different individuals, from bullying, stalking, cyber stalking, and so many other things. There's so much there to be taken care of. How they address that and how they address both protections for the students that are victims, but also the allegations and the protections for the accused throughout that process, and the nuances of how the process is to unfold on college campuses have been certainly challenged and areas of contention for now over a decade or longer. So again, you're absolutely right. I think some of this will yet again be a look to the courts to help determine how the regulations either are or aren't constructed properly.
Yeah. And just a quick thing on that, does it go through the same process of, public comment?
No, because it's Title IX, it's only the Title IV regulations that have to go through the federal negotiated rulemaking process. Now, given that Title IX is so vitally important, there has been considerable, once again, a notice of proposed rulemaking and all of the comments that have gone in and been utilized to potentially bring us to this point. But unlike the master calendar under Title IV, these regulations could go into effect upon publication or likely publication and transitional times that are included and embedded in the proposals themselves. You would imagine, Drumm, and reasonably so, that people can't turn all of this on a dime, or click it on or off like a light switch. So I certainly anticipate that there will be transition periods, but institutions are going to have to start working towards those post haste.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And last, we haven't talked about not that there isn't anything else going on, but we really haven't talked a lot about the legislative side, what's going on the Hill that might impact higher ed.
And there is much to speak about there as well. I'll break it down into two areas and try to be brief but important. We just witnessed within the last 2.5, 3 weeks, Congress completing work on the Consolidated Comprehensive Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2022. Again, you note that we're more than halfway through that fiscal year. It took Congress 5 months for their fiscal year begins on October 1 of the preceding year and runs through September 31st of the following year. That's their fiscal year. So with Congress not completing work on the appropriations bill and all of them until last month, literally we were 5 months into the fiscal year before we had the completion of the process. The good news in higher education is that there was significant support from the House, the Senate, and the Biden administration for increases in higher education. While we didn't hit the high water mark that the three bills would have indicated, there were significant increases. Most notably, a $400 increase in the maximum federal Pell, which would take the July 1 of this year maximum to $6,895. Keep in mind, that's the maximum. The assessment and the criteria under estimated family contributions could make that number lower depending on your EFC, but that's the maximum. There were significant increases in other state and campus-based awards, SEOG, TRIO, campus-based themselves. And there was specific targeted money both to HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, MSIs, other minority serving institutions, and the tribals. And there was also other targeted money for community colleges. So on par and on balance, significant new forms of federal assistance provided to the higher education community in the legislation just passed. That was 2 weeks ago. This week, we received the first indications of President Biden's 2023 fiscal year proposals. That includes a continuation of his campaign commitment to try and double Pell over a series of, I believe it's the 10-year period. He looks to provide another $2,000 in additional Pell, which would take that $6,895 and with simple math, make it $8,895 with incremental increases over each of the next 10 years. A very significant increase in grant assistance for students looking that are coming from our most impoverished, lower socioeconomic areas. And again, continuation of targeted funding for HBCUs, MSIs, HSIs, tribals, and the community colleges. So some good things potentially on the horizon from a funding standpoint. There was also additional money in the Department of Labor in the form of apprenticeships and other specifically vocational and career education focused programs. Again, that is with the desire to bring individuals forward to be able to achieve the infrastructure bill request for rebuilding our nation's roads, bridges, highways, as well as infrastructure in other ways. The other piece of legislation that is being worked on right now that you'll see on CNN talked about and elsewhere are the House and Senate bills on what they call the cybersecurity or the China bills. This is legislation, the Innovation and Competitiveness Act, coming out of the Senate that was actually voted on last June or July. And now the more recently completed House version of that legislation called the America Competes Act. Those two pieces of legislation are now have gone back through, the House bill has gone back through Senate, and now they're heading into a conference between the two bills. These are extensive proposals, well over 2,500 plus pages of statutory change and modifications, new programs, protections for cybersecurity, and a lot of other issues that include the jurisdiction of Homeland Security, DOJ, and so many others. Interestingly enough, there is support for cybersecurity education and other programs in portions of the bill. One other key provision that was sought in the Senate version, but not passed, but actually passed in the House version with a modification, is what we're calling the Levin-Gonzalez Amendment. It includes two independent bills, one called the Jobs Act, which seeks to provide eligibility for federal Pell Grant assistance for short-term programs, eliminating the existing loan program and replacing it with grants, providing additional access for individuals without having to repay that, enlarging the period of that short-term program eligibility from the current 300 to 600 clock hours or equivalent to 150 to 600 clock hours. The one concern with that legislation is that it fails to include proprietary education programs and their students, while a significant proportion of the education in the blue collars and the areas where these licensure, certification, diploma programs are provided, being excluded is a concern that has been expressed by Democrats in the House and in the Senate, as well as by Republicans. The other half of that legislation that is also bipartisan in nature is the College Transparency Act. It's legislation that seeks to collect and utilize significantly more striated data, taking and building on aggregate data and aggregate information that the department posts on the College Navigator and other websites, and making it much more granular so that both Congress as well as the consumer can see even more information on who really is attending what type of institution, what levels of success they're having, and other information. You have Republicans in particular, including Dr. Fox and Mr. Burr, the two ranking members of the Education Committee, that have concerns about the college transparency data collection from a personally identifiable information standpoint, and especially the fact that some of that information is being collected from individuals who don't even have financial aid. So there's a push and pull there. Going back to the short-term program eligibility criterion, not only are proprietary institutions excluded from participation, but so are comprehensively online institutions. So again, you can imagine that entities like Southern New Hampshire University, Western Governors University, and others who have a large following of individuals, and again, have programs that are short-term in nature, and some of those licensure, certificate, and diplomas would be on the outside as well. So those are key issues that are prevalent up on Capitol Hill right now that have to be worked out. There is belief that hopefully both sets of issues can be worked out. If they can't, then the Republicans are probably going to push to have both provisions excluded from the bill, questions of germaneness, and look to have those promoted at a later time through more specific higher education policy legislation.
Well, let's take a breath here because that's a long update.
Sorry, but you asked.
Oh, well, yeah, exactly. We need to do this a little more often because, well, there's been a lot going on there too. So anyway, any real important takeaways for presidents, other than what we've already talked about, which isn't lightweight stuff?
I think the one major other thing for the presidents yet again is Title IX. That will be the first thing that, quite honestly, Drumm, has more immediate impact. So as we look to the publication of the Title IX regulations and the impact and potential changes that come along with that, having your staff prepared, as your law enforcement division, as well as all of the individuals. You have to have your Title IX coordinators. You have to have all of your other individuals that I know are on point with this, but starting to look at that from a president down set of circumstances is something I would strongly encourage.
Great. Well, Tom, thank you again. It's always a pleasure having you on the show. It's great to catch up with you, and we'll talk again soon.
And again, I think you're right. More often would be better, but you guys do a phenomenal job. It's a pleasure for me to be able to chime in every now and again. Drumm, thank you so much for all that you do and for giving me the opportunity to share.
My pleasure, my friend. Take care.
Bye now.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Tom Netting, for his Washington update. Our next guest is Marvin Krislov, president of Pace University in New York City. Marvin will be joining us to talk about how compassion for students drives persistence at Pace, and one of the great things he's doing to make a difference in first-generation students in their family lives. He's also the only person that I know who's a sitting university president who still teaches courses. What a great story, and we're looking forward to having him next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.